Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. In this series of lectures under the title, What is Islam? We are now discussing the question of Sunnah. What is Sunnah? As yet, what I've mentioned is that there is no one unanimous understanding of what Sunnah is. The understanding about Sunnah in the Ummah is divided, and therefore we've got no choice but to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the respective points of view. As yet, I have talked about the first point of view, the most popular one, which claims that whatever the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said, did, or silently approved is Sunnah. I talked about its arguments, supporting arguments, and I've also talked about its criticism that has been raised against it. Then I talked about the second point of view, which is the point of view of the Quranists, who believe that nothing but the Quran constitutes the reliable, authentic source about Islam, and therefore there is no concept of Sunnah in Islam. I mentioned their arguments that support their understanding, and I mentioned the criticism that has been raised against them. Now I move on to the third approach towards Sunnah, which can be described as the midway approach. According to this approach, it is the Quran itself which mentions that there is Sunnah. This approach claims that, like the Quran, Sunnah too is fully preserved. It claims that the Almighty required the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, to go through certain religious practices which in actual fact were coming from the earlier prophets, and these practices were introduced to Muslims in a way that the entire first generation of Muslims came to learn about what these religious practices were. Therefore, they unanimously accepted those practices as very much religious practices emerging from the Prophet, and they transmitted this tradition to the next generations in a manner that there was no gap, no vacuum, no interruption. So, like we have seen in the case of the Quran, in the case of Sunnah too, certain given specific religious practices were adopted by the entire first generation of Muslims, learning them from the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, and then they were transmitted to the next generation, and then the next generation, and so on, until such time that today we have got all those practices in the form of Sunnah, which originate from the Prophet, and there has been no change whatsoever in these practices. The Quran talks about these practices in verse 123 of Surah An-Nahl, chapter 16. The Almighty says, ثُمَّ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ, then we revealed upon you, O Prophet, أَنِ اتَّبِعْ مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا, that you follow the path, the religion of Abraham, Hanifa, fully focused, completely devoted to the cause of it. So, the Almighty asked the Prophet to follow the religious way of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Abraham. Obviously, Ibrahim alayhi salam did not have the Quran revealed to him. So what the Almighty is asking the Prophet to do is to follow the practices which we now describe as Sunnah practices, like Salat, prayer, like Zakat, like fasting, like Hajj, etc. So this is what the significance of Sunnah according to this third point of view is. It's absolutely authentic like the Quran. It's actually based on the Quran, but it's outside the Quran. The Quran doesn't mention these practices. It doesn't mention the details of those practices, how they are to be adopted, because it was not possible for a text to explain how to say the formal prayers, how to do Hajj. So Hajj was already happening. The prayer was taking place because the Prophet prayed and his followers prayed likewise. The Quran only referred to them and asked believers to pray, to do Hajj, etc. Now, where are these practices to be found? In what different forms? Well, first and foremost, these religious practices which constitute the Sunnah are to be found in the ibadat of Muslims, like prayers, like fasting, like zakat, like Hajj, like itikaf, like the takbirat during the days of Tashriq, that is 9th Zulhajj till the 13th of Zulhajj. All these practices are the ones which are, even if they're mentioned in a way in the Quran that you get an idea that something is happening outside the Quran which the Quran is endorsing. So that's one part of the Sunnah. Then we also find Sunnah practices in the form of customs and etiquette of Muslims. When we Muslims meet, we greet each other by saying Assalamu alaikum, and the one who is greeted thus responds by saying Wa alaikum assalam. Likewise, if a person sneezes, he or she says Alhamdulillah, and those who are present would respond by saying Yarhamakullah. Alhamdulillah, thanks be to God. Yarhamakullah, may God's mercy be on you. Likewise, there are quite a few expectations in the domain of personal hygiene that have been required to be gone through. Muslims are expected to remove hair from their armpits and underneath their navel. Muslim men are expected to clip their mustaches so that they do not droop beneath the upper limit of the boundary of the lip, the upper lip. Both Muslim men and women have been asked to clip their nails regularly, and so on and so forth. Likewise, Muslims have been asked to follow certain practices in the case of edibles, what they eat. Even though it's mentioned in the Quran, the real practice of slaughtering the halal animals properly so that the blood gets drained, which is called tazkiyah, is a part of the Sunnah. To say Tasmiyah, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, or Bismillah Allahu Akbar, is also a part of the Sunnah that we have gotten. The Quran mentions it and the Sunnah has practiced it. Likewise, not to consume the flesh of swine, pork, is also what we have gotten through the Sunnah. And likewise, not to have the flesh, to consume the flesh as part of our food of carrion, the dead animal, is also what the Quran has clearly mentioned. But the Sunnah practices have transmitted this practice to the entire Muslim Ummah. Similarly, the fact that we shall not eat the flesh of the animal even though it's halal otherwise, if it's slaughtered in the name of anyone other than Allah. All these practices are now a part of the Muslim Ummah, and no matter where we go, edibles are consumed, taking into consideration these limitations. Likewise, in the social interaction category, we have the practices of nikah, the practices of talaq, both mentioned in the Quran, talaq more than nikah, but these practices took a formal process in the practical world through the Sunnah of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, who introduced these practices to the Muslim Ummah, and people started following them. In order for Sunnah to be understood properly, those who present this midway approach, or you call it the third point of view, they insist that in order for a practice to be Sunnah, there are a number of principles that need to be clearly understood in order for us to be able to distinguish a Sunnah from a non-Sunnah. So one of the things that they mention is that Sunnah is always a practice. A statement attributed to the Prophet, howsoever important it might be, cannot constitute Sunnah. Why? Because the word Sunnah itself reflects the understanding of practice. The Quran mentioned this word Sunnah for the policies that the Almighty follows while running the affairs of this world. So, the way this world unfolds its practices, it follows certain principles which have been described as the Sunnah of the Almighty. So that the Quran says, Sunnat Allah. These are the Sunnahs, policies, practices of the Almighty. Walan tajida li sunnatillahi tabdila. And you will not find any changes in the practices, policies of the Almighty. The word itself is actually mentioning the understanding of a path that has gotten leveled as a consequence of it being used for the purpose of traveling, and as a result of a large number of people and animals going across it, the land gets leveled. So practice is what Sunnah is. Secondly, a Sunnah needs to be a practice which is religious. Why? Because the proponents of this point of view say that the prophets of God have come to us to deliver God's religion. They do not deliver worldly matters to people. This is something which the Quran mentions in Surah Shura, Surah number 42, verse 13, wherein the Almighty has mentioned the names of 5 most prominent messengers of God. Nuh alayhi salam, Noah; Ibrahim alayhi salam, Abraham; Musa alayhi salam, Moses; Isa alayhi salam, Jesus; and Muhammad alayhi salam, the Prophet Muhammad, the last prophet, may God's mercy be on all of them. And after mentioning their names, the Almighty says, they were all required by the Almighty, an aqimuddin, to practice religion, to stay firm in religion. وَلَا تَتَفَرَّقُوا فِيهِ. And do not disintegrate. Do not get divided. That having been mentioned in the Quran, we also find in Hadith, as we have seen earlier, a very clear mention which the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, made when he clarified that Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum. You know your worldly matters better. So he clarified to the people that, look here, do not come to me with expectations of getting insights and clarifications about how to do worldly matters in a more effective way. I have come to deliver religion. So religious practices are what Sunnah are, so that if we know that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, traveled on camelback, for example, it would not constitute Sunnah because it has got nothing to do with religion or religious guidance. Thirdly, they also say that Sunnah will not be in matters where the Prophet followed the Quran. Because when we are talking about Sunnah, we are talking about a source which is, apart from the Quran, an additional independent source of Islamic learning. So the Quran tells the Prophet, for example, to do jihad, and he did so likewise. The Quran requires the Prophet to punish those who have committed certain crimes, and he implemented those punishments. But these practices of the Prophet that have been reported in the books of history are actually examples of the way the Prophet followed the Quran. However, there are many other practices which were introduced by the Prophet, even though the Quran mentions them as well. Like, for example, as I said, formal prayers. Formal prayers that are said 5 times a day were actually introduced by the Prophet. We don't even have the number of 5 mentioned in the Quran regarding prayers, because the Quran assumes that Muslims already know what formal prayers are, how many of them are required to be practiced every day, and what are the formalities that are required to follow. So what is done as a consequence of responding to the call of the Quran, or the expectations of the Quran, is not Sunnah. Sunnah are practices independent of the Quran. Then they also clarify that if a certain Sunnah gets extended by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, by being offered in additional forms, those additional forms of those practices would not constitute a new distinct Sunnah. If the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, introduced prayer, the formal prayer as-salat, as a Sunnah, the entire mention of as-salat in Sunnah, the complete description of it, dividing it into the categories of farz, what is binding, and nawafil tatawwu, what is optional. All these put together are the Sunnah of prayer. So we would not say that the additional prayers, apart from over and above the obligatory farz prayers, are Sunnah prayers. They're all a part of the Sunnah. Farz prayers are also Sunnah. They have also been delivered to the Ummah through Sunnah and not through the Quran. So what they would say is that we should not confuse the additional practices to be forming new and additional categories of Sunnah. They all belong to one Sunnah, which, for example, in the case of prayers, are the Sunnah practices, some of which are binding obligatory and others are non-obligatory optional. Then they also emphasize the fact that Sunnah is not derived from Hadith. We have got Sunnah from the practice of Muslims, unanimously adopted by all Muslims, and then transmitted through uninterrupted consistency. It was adopted by all different segments of the Muslim society. No matter where Muslims went, they said prayers, the same prayers which the Prophet said, and this practice has come down to us through the same unanimity, wherein the whole process was transmitted in a way that there are no gaps. Hadith is a source which, even though very important, and we'll see later what exactly is Hadith and what its significance is, it was transmitted by individuals, to individuals, unlike in the case of Sunnah, which was transmitted by one entire generation to the next entire generation. So, even though Hadith does include the mention of Sunnah, why? Because obviously when Hadith mentions the record of the Prophet's life, one important aspect of the Prophet's life was the Sunnah practice. So we do find the mention of Sunnah in Hadith, but Hadith is not the primary source of knowing Sunnah. The primary source of understanding and knowing Sunnah is the practice of Muslims, which we see all across the Muslim world. Now, there are at least two questions which arise as a consequence of this particular understanding of Sunnah. One is that if Sunnah, like the Quran, is unanimously agreed upon by all Muslims, as is the claim of the proponents of this point of view, why then do we find that there are differences, a number of differences, in the way Muslims say their prayers, for example? The answer to this question provided by these people who put across this understanding as the only valid understanding of Sunnah is that the formal prayer that was given by the Prophet to the entire Ummah was comprised of two components. There were some practices, there were some utterances, azkar, which were made binding, and there were others which were optional, left at the discretion of individuals to do the manner they would choose to. So, when it comes to the binding practices and binding utterances, there is no difference of opinion whatsoever amongst Muslims. But when it comes to the question of optional practices and optional utterances, we do understandably have a number of differences because there was no one expectation that was made binding. So, for example, in the case of formal prayers, all Muslims face the Qibla, they do their wudu before they start their prayers. The number of rakats, units in first prayers is the very same. All agree that there is one ruku and two sujood in prayers. After every two rakats, they sit for qada and so on. There's a long list of rituals which all Muslims agree to are to be followed in the case of formal prayers. But there are others where they differ because they were not made binding. The second question is every religious practice of Muslims sunnah? Because the claim is that the sunnah is to be found in the religious practices of Muslims. So is it that whenever there is a religious practice adopted by Muslims anywhere, it's sunnah? Well, the answer is no. There are two kinds of religious practices which Muslims follow. One belongs to the category of sunnah and the other belongs to the category of bid'ah. A bid'ah is a religious innovation. A bid'ah is a religious practice which is followed by some Muslims, but most certainly not all Muslims, unlike in the case of sunnah. And this is so because it was not given to Muslims by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. It was given to them by somebody else in the later times. And therefore, it's a local affair. It's confined to a certain geographical location and to a certain population. And it's a condemned practice because no individual other than the Prophet has the right, the authority to introduce anything in religion. So, bid'ah is different from sunnah. Sunnah practices are the religious practices, according to this point of view, which can be seen, practiced all across the Muslim world by all practicing Muslims. With that, we come to the end of the discussion on sunnah. There's only one question that remains, that if that is what sunnah is, what exactly is then the status of hadith? That's a discussion that we are going to take up in the next two sessions. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.